Hello, Wallapalooza. I'm Karie Riddle, coming to you from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm teaching political science at Calvin University. And I'm going to talk today about my paper entitled Learning to be an Anti-Racist, Anti-Imperialist Feminist, Lessons from Sojourner Truth's Collaboration with White Feminists. Now you may have noticed that Mary Wollstonecraft is not in the title, and indeed she's not really in my paper too much, but I'm interested in this dynamic within the scholarship on Wollstonecraft, which many of you have participated in and contributed to, that talks about how she's making all of these universal claims for women and about what we need for women's equality, but she's really coming at those claims from her own social location, whether that's from whiteness, from the middle class, from Europe versus Turkish women in harems and these sort of things. So Mary Wollstonecraft has racist and imperialist undertones to a lot of her work. So my question is, what do we do with that kind of white feminism? Cancel culture would tell us, cancel it, ignore it, get rid of it. Or we might be tempted rather to sort of lift her up as an icon, but cover over the problems with this kind of work. And I think we need to find some sort of middle ground that allows us to use and recover white feminists from the past and white feminists at present who can collaborate with feminists of other races, feminists from non-Western contexts. So how can we basically try to have an anti-imperialist and anti-racist collaboration among feminists from all of these different social locations? So that's sort of the broad motivating question, and the specific version of that question, how I'm going to sort of approach this huge question about feminist collaboration, is thinking about Sojourner Truth and her example. So she worked a lot with white feminists in 19th century America, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who very much place themselves in Wollstonecraft's legacy. I mean, they have her right up front at the beginning of their 1881 work, History of Women's Suffrage. So they very much see themselves as taking up the Wollstonecraft mantle. So how did Sojourner Truth work with them, even though, like Wollstonecraft, they had some racist undertones to their feminism? So for my approach for my paper, I use Uma Narayan's post-colonial feminist thought, and she lays out some interesting specific roles that non-white, non-Western women are often forced into when they come into white Western spaces. So I'm going to use her roles to think about how Sojourner Truth was interacting with white feminists in 19th century America. In my paper, I go in detail through 4 different collaborations, including with Harriet Beecher Stowe, Stanton and Anthony, Frances Dana Gage, and Olive Gilbert. I'm only going to have time today to talk about a couple of those collaborations, but I will briefly mention all 4 of them. And the upshot of the project is to try to come up with some recommendations for how white feminists can pursue anti-imperialist and anti-racist collaboration. So Uma Narayan's work. This is coming from her book called Dislocating Cultures, which has been around for a while, but I still find it to be tremendously useful. So Narayan's context for her work is thinking about multicultural education, in which non-Westerners, people that she refers to as third world women, are coming into Western spaces, and there's still sort of a power imbalance there. So you have Western people who are still sort of in control of the conversation, still setting the agenda. They're inviting third world people in to share. But in that process, because there's still that power imbalance, these third world people tend to get slotted into these different roles, and they're only allowed to do so much in these contexts. And I think this is, again, really relevant for Truth, because she is so often one of just a few Black people working in primarily white social reform circles in the 19th century. So the first role that Narayan talks about is the emissary. Here, the third world person is invited in only to present cultural riches. So they're only supposed to talk about good things from their culture. This very often turns into them talking about high culture, high art, fine music, things like that. So they're not really going to be allowed to critique anything about their culture. Because the Western people, who are again driving the conversation, only want to hear about good things. The second role is the mirror. Here, the third world person is placed into the role of critiquing the big bad West. So here you have woke Westerners that know that the West has done a lot of bad things in the third world, and so they just want to hear from this person, like, confirm all the bad things that we've done. We know we're so bad, let's sort of wallow in it, right? The problem with this is the third world person can't really say anything of their own. They are only talking about what the West has done. They aren't saying much of value or interest to the Western ears about their own cultures. And finally, the authentic insider. This is somebody who's invited to speak for all of the others. And the problem here is you only hear from one person, and then suddenly you think, oh, I know what the Indian perspective on human rights is, or oh, now I know what the Vietnamese approach to democracy is, as if there weren't contestation within those cultures. And often authentic insiders are relegated to saying only those things that the Westerners want to hear. So these are all problematic. They're all narrowing people down. They're not allowing people from the third world, from outside the West, to just say whatever they want to say on any topic and to sort of participate as a moral equal in these conversations, because again, you have that power asymmetry at work. So what can we do? Narayan says we need to have serious and respectful engagement with the substantive ideas that are coming from other cultures. And again, we need to be treating these people as moral equals. So that is the lens that I use to analyze these different collaborations. The first one I'll talk about in a bit of detail is with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So Sojourner Truth is the only Black woman who appears in their book, History of Women's Suffrage, published in 1881. And they were all very much wrapped up in these women's rights movements happening in the middle of the 19th century in America. The big question was, is suffrage for everyone? Is suffrage just for Black men after the end of the Civil War in America? Or is suffrage for white women? So Stanton and Anthony were at first arguing for universal suffrage because they were afraid if it wasn't universal, then white women were going to be left behind. But they made really racist arguments on behalf of universal suffrage. And Sojourner Truth was never comfortable with that. She never was on board with those kinds of arguments. And so she would get up and she would talk about racism, and she would talk about religion and also women's rights, but she would get up and talk about whatever she wanted to talk about, basically. But Stanton and Anthony still really sort of latched on to Truth and made her very prominent within their movement until there was a split within the women's movement between the Republican Party. Remember, that's the party of Lincoln at the time. The Republican Party was sponsoring the American Women's Suffrage Association, and then Stanton and Anthony went the other direction. They actually allied themselves with a lot of racist Democrats, and they were forming the National Women's Suffrage Association. And Truth ended up on the other side of that split from Stanton and Anthony. But still, she was very influential. She was very interesting at the time. I think they did know that they needed sort of the cover of having a Black woman on their side. And so they basically took from Truth only what they wanted her to say about women's rights. And they ignored a lot of the other stuff that she was trying to say about religion, that she was trying to say about racism. And importantly, there was another woman named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, another Black woman who was really important in the women's suffrage movement at the time. And they chose Sojourner Truth as their authentic insider rather than Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So they're choosing one Black woman, they're allowing her to speak for all Black women, and you're not hearing about any of the contestation that might have emerged among Black women or even among different parts of the women's movement. So again, using Narayan, I'm arguing that Stanton and Anthony are placing Truth into that authentic insider role. A really positive example of collaboration is with Olive Gilbert. So she was Truth's amanuensis. She was the person that was working with her to put together the narrative that they published in 1851. And they had a close working relationship. They were already friends through the Northampton Association, which was a sort of utopian community in Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. And importantly, Truth initiated this collaboration. She was seeing the success of other slave narratives, and she needed a way to make some money. And so she asked Gilbert if she would help her to record her memoirs, because Truth, of course, was illiterate. And so Olive Gilbert does this. She works very closely with Truth on her narrative. And there's really clear evidence of disagreement in their text. Sojourner Truth very often says things that makes Olive Gilbert really uncomfortable. But some scholars interpret this in a really positive light. They say that Gilbert is a really reliable oral historian because you can tell exactly which ideas are Sojourner Truth's and which ideas are Olive Gilbert's. So that's a really interesting example of a collaboration, and it appears to avoid all of the roles that Narayan highlights as problematic. A couple other collaborations that appear in my paper, just wanted to note that So I've already mentioned Truth as authentic insider in her relationship with Stanton and Anthony. I also find evidence of Truth as emissary in Harriet Beecher Stowe's article, The Libyan Sibyl, which was all about Sojourner Truth, published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1863. Here she really only takes good things about Truth, also presents her as really exotic, and this is the most striking example of really Orientalist approaches to Sojourner Truth. And then I'm sure you're familiar with the anti-woman speech made popular by Frances Dana Gage. And I think that Gage is using truth as a mirror here. She's reflecting back onto white women the harms that racist white feminism has done. But again, that becomes all about the white women and not so much about Truth herself. There's also a lot of evidence that Truth never even said the phrase, "Ain't I a woman?" So we have a white feminist here putting words into the mouth of a black feminist, which of course is going to be problematic. So some of the preliminary conclusions that I reach from this, looking at all of these different collaborations between Sojourner Truth and these white feminists. First, pretty obvious, build close relationships with feminists of other races and other ethnicities. I think that's a pretty basic one. Second, if you're going to be using other people's stories for feminist causes, only do that in ways that faithfully represent what those women want, even if you disagree with them. And here I'm looking particularly at Stanton and Anthony. I mean, they're basically avoiding all of Sojourner Truth's other arguments about race, about religion. They're only taking a narrow part of what Sojourner Truth is about and publishing that. Third, we need to graciously and respectfully engage with the substantive views of feminists coming from other races and ethnicities, again, whether we agree or disagree with them. And this is exactly what Olive Gilbert did when she inserted her own voice into Truth's narrative, right? She saw her as a moral equal. She was arguing against her at times. And finally, welcome invitation and engagement initiated by non-white feminists. Olive Gilbert welcomed Sojourner Truth in when she suggested collaboration on the narrative. One idea for possible future research, I'm considering doing some interviews with leaders of the 2017 Women's March on Washington to talk about how their collaboration has and has not worked, and relating that back to some of my preliminary conclusions about good collaboration. Thank you very much.